This time it's 5 over-the-counter Grand Prix races. When you think about Grand Prix or the TT, you tend to think about the glamorous world of the works Grand Prix racer. But the Grand Prix grid has always been filled out by large numbers of plucky privateers, each one riding a bike that he could buy over the counter. And so here are 5 classic over the counter privateer Grand Prix bikes. Macky Harley Davidson 350 singles. Macky was an Italian aircraft manufacturer founded in 1912 by Giulio Macky in Varese in northwestern Lombardy region. During both wars the company produced a number of combat aircraft. However, with the war over, the company knew that it would need to diversify if it was going to survive, and so in 1951 they began production of their first motorcycles. Initially production focused on small capacity 2-stroke single-cylinder units, then very much in demand in the Italian market. But in 1957 they began production of their first overhead valve motorcycles, fitted with a 175 or a 250cc single-cylinder engine which was mounted horizontally in the style of Motor Guzzi. In 1960 Harley-Davidson would purchase a 50% stake in Macky's motorcycle division, and with the extra money invested they were able to develop the 250 into a competent Grand Prix racer, the Ala d'Oro or Golden Wing. The machine would be enlarged later up to 350cc and would be used by Renzo Pasolini to finish third in the 350cc World Championship in 1966, with Calcaroas matching his performance in the 1968 World Championship. The 250 ran a 248cc engine with a bore and stroke of 72 by 61 and peak power was 32 horsepower at 10,000 rpm, while the 350 was a 349.2cc with 77 by 75 mm. Peak power for the 350 was around 42 horsepower at 9,000 rpm. While the basic engine design may have been outdated by the 1960s, it was nevertheless quite an effective racing machine, both at club level and international level. But by the 1970s it was clear the bike had had its day, and 2-strokes were definitely the way forward. The company developed a parallel twin 2-stroke, and this machine would be incredibly successful, winning the World Championships at 250cc class in 74, 75 and 76, and the 350 class in the latter year also. But by the end of the 70s Harley-Davidson was losing interest in the Varese factory and would sell it to Cagiva, a motocross manufacturer, in 1978. The Norton Manx. Norton began production of its overhead cam racers all the way back in 1927 with the advent of the CS1. This would be developed into the Norton International in the mid-30s, which would be available as a fast road bike and of course an over-the-counter racer. However, after the war in 1947, Norton would introduce a complete redesign of the engine to produce the 30M and the 40M, better known as the Norton Manx. The engine was available as a 500cc, with early models running a bore and stroke of 79.62 by 100, and later post-1960 models running a more square dimension of 86 by 85.6, with those early models running on relatively poor quality fuel making 47 horsepower, while the later model would make 54 horsepower at 7,200 rpm. A 348cc 350 model was available, which produced around 35 horsepower. Early models would use the plunger garden gate frame. In 48 the bike would gain twin leading shoes, and 1950 would see the introduction of the featherbed frame, producing what is probably the most famous Norton racer of them all. By the mid-50s however the Manx was outpaced by the Italian Maltese, and Norton began to examine the possibilities of a number of replacements for the Manx, including one with a horizontally mounted version of the engine a la Motor Guzzi, but also of course a 4-cylinder machine. But by 1954 motorcycle sales in Great Britain were already on the decline, leaving Norton with no choice but to withdraw from Grand Prix racing as a works team. But this was not the end for the Manx of course, and the machine would continue as a privateer racer, winning its final Grand Prix in 1968. The Suzuki RG500. Okay, no prizes for spotting that this is not an RG500, but the T500 is important in Suzuki's Grand Prix history because the TR500, Suzuki's first entry into the top class of Grand Prix racing, was very much based on this model and would provide Suzuki with their first win in the 500cc class. But as successful as the TR was, Suzuki realised that if it wanted to beat MV in the 500 class, they were going to need something rather more specialised. And so 1974 would see the introduction of the RG500. This was a 495cc water-cooled square 4 engine with disc valve induction. Early machines ran a bore and stroke of 56 by 50.5. This was replaced by a square engine of 54 by 54 in 1975, and the works machine would prove successful straight out of the box, with Barry Sheene taking second place behind Phil Reed on the MV Augusta in the 1974 French Grand Prix. Unfortunately, Sheene's injury at Daytona would hamper Suzuki's early success, and it would not be until 1975 with the Dutch TT before Barry Sheene would take his first victory on the RG500. And indeed 1976 would prove to be the year Suzuki became the dominant force in 500 Grand Prix racing, with the Suzuki taking 11 of the top 12 places in the World Championship that year, with the machine now available for public sale. But the icing on the cake for Suzuki was Sheene's dominance in taking the World Championship title, a feat he would reproduce in 1977. But following this, the machine would struggle behind the Yamaha of Kenny Roberts. But that didn't stop Suzuki winning the World Championship 2 more times in the early 80s with the RG, with Franco Uncini and Marco Lucanelli. But perhaps the most important role that the RG played was as a customer bike, putting truly competitive machinery into the hands of the privateer for the first time, swelling the grids and rejuvenating the 500cc Grand Prix class. The Sealy, 7R and G50. AJS was a company famous for its single overhead cam racing singles. Pre-war, these machines had been called the R7. However, 1948 would see an all-new model with a completely revised engine, and this would be the AJS 7R. Like the earlier model, this was a 350cc overhead cam racing engine, but otherwise was a completely new design, showing no parts at all with the old motor. The engine was of 348cc with a bore and stroke of 74 by 81. The original machine made around 30 to 31 horsepower, running on fairly low octane fuel then available just after the war at 7,000 RPM. The bike made use of a swinging arm frame, years before Norton would do so. But although there was a works team, the machine was principally designed for clubman racers, a role at which it truly excelled, filling the Grand Prix grids throughout the 1950s and into the early 60s. And so popular was it that AMC would make a 500cc version which they christened the matchless G50. But while the machine was popular throughout its production run, and the order books were always full, the machine was a lost lead. Simply put, AMC lost money on every bike they sold. And when AMC hit financial trouble in 1961, they pulled the machine from the market, even though it actually had a full order book at the time. And so enter Colin Sealy, a man who was a multiple British sidecar champion and a top 3 finisher in the World Sidecar Championship. Sealy began production of his own motorcycle chassis in the early 60s, and indeed his early chassis were designed to make use of the AMC motor. But when AMC announced the end of production of the engines, Colin moved quickly and purchased AMC's racing department. While there's no doubt that this was a gutsy move for a small manufacturer, it turned out to be a clever one, with Sealy machines seeing success at both national and international Grand Prix level. And of course in racing, success brings sales. And by the latter part of the 60s, production was centering around the G50 powered example, one of which took Dave Croxford to victory in the 1968 British 500cc Championship, a feat he repeated the following season. 68 also saw John Cooper secure victory at the Northwest 200, and the following year in 1969, the G50 powered Sealy would take 3rd, 4th and 5th places at the Senior TT, whilst at the Northwest 200, John Blanchard would repeat John Cooper's success of the previous year. Even into the early 70s, with riders such as Peter Williams, the bike would remain competitive, but like the MVs it chased around the circuits of the world, it would soon be made obsolete by the advent of all new two-strokes. But Sealys continue to be used even today in classic racing. The Honda NSR 500. The late 60s would see Honda withdraw its works team from the Grand Prix paddock, as the company strove to become a major car manufacturer. but at the end of the 70s they attempted to return with the NR500 4-stroke oval piston racer, but Honda had underestimated the development of two-stroke machines in the intervening years, and the bike was horrifically uncompetitive, being slow, underpowered and unreliable too. But of course Honda did have a backup plan in the form of the two-stroke V3 NR500, a machine which Freddie Spencer would win the 1983 500cc World Championship with. But even at that point, Honda knew they would need more power if they were going to be continually successful into the 1980s, and this would lead to the introduction of the NSR 500 in 1984. The machine then used of a V4 of 112 degrees with a bore stroke of 54 by 54.5 to give 499 cc's. The machine, like the V3 before it, quickly became dominant, winning the 1985 Grand Prix World title. And Honda would continuously develop and improve the machine throughout its production life, eventually winning 10 World Championships, including 6 in a row between 94 and 99 for Mick Doohan of Australia. This was of course the works machines, but throughout the 80s and into the early 2000s, customer versions of the machine were made available, and while not as sophisticated as the full works machine, it would provide a number of riders with Grand Prix podium finishes and the odd win or two. Whatever bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.